The storm struck like a beast unleashed, tearing through the night with winds that howled like sirens and rain that hammered down like fists. When the roof collapsed with a deafening crack, she thought she had lost everything, until she realized she wasn't alone. Through the chaos, her dog pressed against her side, refusing to leave, no matter how much the world outside tried to rip them apart. The day had started like any other, though the air carried a strange weight to it. Dark clouds had begun rolling in by mid-morning, but no one in the neighborhood could have predicted the fury that was about to descend. Emily stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky shift from gray to an ominous greenish hue. The birds had gone silent hours ago, and the stillness outside carried a tension that made her stomach tighten. Her German shepherd, Max, paced near the back door. He wasn't the kind of dog who spooked easily, but today his ears were pinned back, and his steps were restless. Every few moments, he would glance at her with a low whine in his throat, as though urging her to understand something she couldn't yet see. "Storm's coming, boy," Emily said softly, trying to steady her own nerves. She reached down to run her fingers through his thick fur, but Max only pressed closer, his body rigid, gaze fixed on the swaying trees beyond the window. By noon, the wind had picked up. The weather alerts on her phone buzzed one after another, each one escalating the warnings: severe thunderstorm, possible tornadoes, seek shelter immediately. Emily frowned. She had lived through plenty of storms before, but something about this one felt different. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Even breathing seemed harder with the pressure dropping so fast. She moved through the house, closing blinds, locking windows, securing what she could. The sound of the wind grew louder, like an approaching freight train, shaking the walls and rattling the frames. Rain began to fall in sheets, slapping hard against the glass. Max barked sharply when a branch slammed against the side of the house, his body lowering into a protective stance. Emily's phone rang. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. "Emily. Get to the basement, now. The radio says the worst is about to hit. Don't wait." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the line cut out in static. Her heart hammered. She grabbed a flashlight, a blanket, and pulled Max toward the stairs leading down. But before they could descend, a sound like nothing she had ever heard before roared above them. It was a tearing, splintering noise, the sound of a roof giving way under forces it was never built to withstand. The ceiling cracked open with a violent snap, sending shards of wood and insulation raining down. Emily screamed and stumbled backward as the living room filled with chaos. Rain poured directly inside now, soaking the furniture in seconds, the wind whipping so hard it sent picture frames flying off the walls. She dropped to her knees, covering her head, but before she could crumble into panic, Max was there. He pushed against her side with his solid frame, planting himself between her and the storm. His growl rumbled deep, steady, not at the intruders of the world but at the chaos itself, as if daring the storm to take him on. Emily clutched his fur, burying her face against him as the storm raged overhead. The house groaned, windows shattered one after another, and the roar outside built to a crescendo that made it impossible to think. All she could do was hold on, not just to the dog beside her, but to the fragile thread of hope he represented. "Don't leave me, Max," she whispered through tears. "Please, don't leave me." But Max didn't move. Not when the roof split wider, not when lightning lit up the ruins of the living room, not when the storm screamed so loud it drowned out her sobs. He stayed pressed against her, his warmth anchoring her to the moment, refusing to abandon her even as the world threatened to collapse. In that instant, Emily realized something profound. The storm might take the roof, the walls, even the home she had built with her own hands, but it could not take this. The bond between her and Max was unshakable, unbreakable. And in the darkest hour, it was the one thing holding her together. The sound changed first. Amid the roar of wind and the drumming rain, a new tone crept in, a thin metallic screech that rose and fell like a knife on stone. Emily lifted her head just enough to see the chandelier in the dining room beyond swaying at a slant, its chain stretched taut as if an invisible hand were yanking it sideways. The roof had already torn open above the living room, but now the pressure inside the house shifted again, a hollow thump rolling through the walls like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Max's body stiffened. He pressed into her with a deliberate push, and she understood. Move. Okay, she whispered, fighting the tremor in her legs as she crawled. The floor was slick with rain, grit and plaster scraping her knees through soaked denim. Max walked half sideways against her hip, his shoulder a brace, his flank steady as a rail. Another gust slammed what remained of the front door against its frame with a bang that rattled the picture hooks still clinging to the wall. The chandelier groaned. Emily's mind flashed on the simplest of storm safety rules: interior room, lowest level, away from glass, and she steered for the hallway that cut through the center of the house. The hallway door had swollen from the sudden soak and stuck for a breath. Emily put her weight into it, teeth clenched, and it gave with a wet pop. They tumbled through as a sheet of rain chased them, the door bumping closed behind with a useless, watery click. The hall was dark except for the ragged pulses of lightning knifing under the door jambs from the living room. Family photos hung crooked. One had fallen face down, glass cracked into a spiderweb. In the flicker, Emily caught the smiling face inside, her sister on a summer day years earlier, sunlight in her hair. The sight buckled something warm and painful in Emily's chest. She dragged her gaze away and focused on doors: bathroom, linen closet, basement, bedroom. Basement, she told herself. Concrete walls, safer. But when she reached the basement door and yanked, it wouldn't open. The knob turned, the door moved half an inch and stopped hard, blocked by something heavy on the other side. The wind chose that moment to scream again, the pitch rising, a sucking sound like air being ripped from the mouth of a bottle. Max snapped his head back toward the living room and issued a bark, just one, clipped, commanding. He planted himself between Emily and the basement door, then touched his nose to her hand and pulled. He was steering her away. "What is it?" she breathed, though she understood. If the stairwell was blocked, getting trapped there in rising water or under debris could be fatal. The bathroom, then, interior, no windows. She pivoted, heart banging so hard she felt it in her throat, and shouldered into the bathroom. The light switch clicked to nothing. The room was a blue-gray cave, lit by lightning stuttering in the hall. The tub crouched along the far wall like a boat beached in tile. "Get in," she told herself, and climbed. Max followed without hesitation, front paws on the porcelain edge, then a gathering of muscle and he was in beside her, heavy and solid. Emily pulled the shower curtain around them, not for any real protection but to make the small space feel smaller, contained. The curtain smelled like plastic and laundry soap. Max smelled like warm fur dampened by rain and stress. Emily hooked her arm around his neck and pressed her face to his wet coat. "You're okay," she murmured against him, even as she shook. "You're okay, you're okay." The house answered with a jolt. Somewhere to their left, wood split with a gunshot crack. A moment later came a second sound, not the sharpness of breaking, but the slow, low grind of weight failing. Emily's mind ran wild, mapping the location. Dining room? Laundry? Roof beams? She could picture the lines of the house in her head the way mechanics can picture engines, studs and joists, load-bearing walls, trusses intersecting above, all the hidden strength that made a home more than drywall and paint. And she could feel that hidden strength being tested past its limits. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She jerked, fumbled it free, and the screen lit her face blue. Emergency alert, tornado warning. Seek shelter immediately. If you are in a mobile home, vehicle, or outdoors, move to the closest substantial shelter. The timestamp glared, now. As if the storm hadn't already made itself clear. A call flashed across the top of the screen, "Mrs. Thompson." Emily swiped with a sloppy finger. "Mrs. Thompson?" Static answered, then the old woman's voice, tight and thin. Emily? Are you, oh, thank God, are you safe? In the bathroom. Are you in your safe room? Emily asked, voice too loud in the small space. I tried to get to the hallway, but the back porch, the line hissed. The porch came loose, I think. The door won't. A thud bled through the speaker, and Mrs. Thompson gasped. Oh! Max lifted his head at the sound and gave another single bark, short, as if acknowledging a voice he recognized. Emily squeezed the phone. Stay where you are. As soon as it passes, I'll come. The call cut. The phone went dead dark. Emily stared at the blank screen, then down at the battery indicator. She'd seen a heartbeat before, 6%. Power had gone earlier with a pop. She'd heard it, and the phone had burned through what little charge remained, searching and shouting into a network torn by wind. Max nudged her hand once, twice. His breathing was steady, deeper than hers. The steadiness calmed her, the same way the weight of a seatbelt pressed against your lap on a plane reminded you that you were anchored to something designed to carry you through. We'll check on her, Emily told him, because saying it made the promise feel real. We will. A thready whistle snaked under the bathroom door, growing louder, spiraling into a scream. The shower curtain puffed toward them, then snapped back, the air pressure playing with plastic. Emily shoved herself flatter against the tub and tugged the curtain to cover Max's back. He didn't flinch. Another rumble rolled through the house, the kind of deep-bellied vibration she felt in her bones rather than heard. She imagined the storm as a living thing moving down their street, shouldering aside trees, ripping shingles like paper confetti, sampling each house for weakness. The weakness in hers made itself known at last. With the finality of a verdict, the dining room ceiling let go. Even through the bathroom walls, the sound was enormous, a full-body crash of wet drywall, timber, glass, furniture. Water thundered as it found fresh paths. The tub shivered on its feet. Something in the hall fell and skittered, bumping against the bathroom door, and the door bowed inward slightly with the weight of it. Max shifted forward, braced his chest against Emily, and planted both front paws against the porcelain like anchor points. Time bent. It became the count of her breaths and the count of Max's, the stream of her thoughts as she gave herself small tasks, in for 4, out for 4. Check the doorknob. Don't. Listen. That's the wind. That's the house. That's the other crash in the hall. Ignore it. You're in the tub. The tub is strong. Max is here. Max is here. Max is here. She realized she was whispering his name between breaths like a prayer. And then, as suddenly as if someone had thrown a switch, the sound thinned. The feral banshee wind diminished to a hard, constant blow. The rain retreated from drum to hiss. The house, no longer forced into a howl, groaned and quieted around them. Lightning still flickered, but the strobing had more space between strikes. Emily didn't move for another 20 count. She waited for the sudden return of the shriek, the next hammer. When it didn't come, she slid her hand off Max's back and unhooked the curtain. Easy, she said, more to herself than to him. The bathroom was a ruin of small things, toiletries scattered, towels and puddles, the mirror spotted with water. But it was standing. She swung her legs out of the tub carefully, testing the tile with her heel. It held. Max stepped out after her, shaking once, water flinging off in an arc that glittered in a lightning splash. He looked to the door, then back at Emily. Ready? His posture asked. Let's see, she said, and gripped the doorknob. She opened to the hall. The hallway had lost its ceiling in patches, insulation hung down in pink, wet clumps, drooling. The family photos lay scattered like the dead at the baseboards. Farther down, the doorway to the living room framed a view of sky where roof had been, a ragged rectangle of angry clouds still racing past. Rain blew in at an angle through the opening, hissing across the floor. Emily's dining room table, her grandmother's maple, too heavy for two people to move without swearing, lay on its side halfway into the hall, legs in the air like a capsized horse. She picked her way around it, Max glued to her thigh. The living room looked like a stage after a catastrophe. The sofa had shifted 2 feet, a cushion half sucked toward the gap above as if the room had tried to vomit it to the sky. The rug was a sodden raft. The chandelier from the dining room had finally given up the fight, it lay smashed, crystals spread like hailstones. The air smelled of wet wood, dirt, and something else, sharp, chemical, prickling along the inside of her nose. "Gas," she said aloud, and felt her stomach drop. The faint hiss under the rain said she hadn't imagined it. Behind the kitchen wall, a line had likely split when the roof tore. She backed away, breathing shallow. "We need out." She scanned for a path. The front door had blown inward, but the porch beyond it was no longer there, only ragged joists jutting into a ravine of tangled shrubs and the chunked remains of the steps. The back door from the kitchen would mean crossing near the gas line. The side window in the guest room? Maybe. She turned, and Max was already looking down the short cross hall toward the guest room, as if he'd arrived at the same calculation half a thought before her. "Smart boy," she murmured. "Let's go." They moved as a unit, her hand in his ruff, his shoulder a guide. At the guest room, Emily shoved the window sash. It slid up obediently, the one mercy of an old house lovingly maintained. The screen clung stubbornly until Max leaned forward, bumped it with his muzzle, then stepped back and looked up at her. She ripped the screen free with a tearing pop and lobbed it into the shrubs outside. A heady, rain-washed wind muscled into the room, washing some of the gas smell away. Emily eased herself onto the sill, feet searching for footing on the slick vinyl siding and the narrow strip of flowerbed edging 3 feet below. Max stood with his forepaws on the sill, waiting. "I'm going first," she told him, voice firmer than she felt. "Then you jump." She lowered herself, dropped. Her feet hit mud, her knees buckled, she caught herself against the wall with a grunt. Max watched for 1 beat, then launched. He landed with a thud that vibrated up her shins and was instantly at her side, checking her with a nudge to her hip. She grabbed his collar, pulled him toward clear ground, and together they jogged, lopsided, urgent, away from the gas hissing somewhere behind the kitchen wall. They reached the side yard. The fence lay flattened into a broken picket path toward the street. The neighborhood beyond looked wrong, like someone had reached down and scraped their palms across it. Branches everywhere. A car on the corner nosed into a hedge at an angle that made no sense. A trampoline they didn't own blinked at them from 2 houses down, caught upside down on a power pole like a jellyfish impaled on a spear. The sky was still hard and dark, but the deepest frenzy had moved on. In the distance the storm's voice faded, still furious, but elsewhere now. A frail, high voice cut across the hiss of rain. "Help!" It came from the right, thin and breathy, and there was only one person it could be. "Mrs. Thompson," Emily said. Max was already moving, pulling gently on the pressure of her hand in his coat, tracking the sound to the shared hedge line. A section of the hedge had collapsed into Mrs. Thompson's side yard, and the old woman's screened porch, once a cozy square of wicker chairs and potted geraniums, leaned away from the house at a worrisome angle, its roof peeled like a tin can lid. "Emily," the voice called again, and this time it came from lower, oddly muffled. Emily followed Max around the buckled hedge to the gap where the porch steps should be. The steps had torn free. The door into the house was warped on its hinges, stuck halfway open, and in the shadow beyond, Emily could make out a shape, small, hunched, trapped by a tangle of fallen framing. "I'm here!" Emily shouted, and the relief in her own voice almost knocked her over. "I'm here, I'm here." Max leaned forward and sniffed, then emitted a deep chuff, not a bark. It was the sending sound he used when he'd located something specific, a favorite toy under a couch, a lost mitten in the yard. He glanced back at Emily, ears forward, ready. The storm had torn their world raw, flayed the roof from their home, and pushed them into a new map of hazards, but here was the next task, the next right thing. "We'll get you out," Emily told the shadow beyond the door, then took a breath that tasted like rain and timber and fear and reached for the wreckage. "We're not going anywhere." Max stayed at her side, the exact distance of a heartbeat away. The sight of Mrs. Thompson half buried in her collapsed porch electrified Emily into motion. The storm had moved on, but its aftermath was no less deadly. Jagged boards leaned at precarious angles, the roof above the porch hanging by little more than splintered beams. The structure creaked under its own weight, every shift threatening to crush whatever was beneath. Emily's hands shook as she pulled at a loose beam. It shifted only slightly before catching against another. She tried again, putting her weight into it, but the wet wood slipped in her grip. Max pressed close, growling low, not at her, not at Mrs. Thompson, but at the precarious structure that loomed above them. His hackles bristled as though he could sense the imminent danger. "It's okay, boy," Emily panted, wiping rain and grit from her forehead. "We'll get her out. We have to." Inside the shadows, Mrs. Thompson coughed, a wet, raspy sound. "Emily, dear, don't you dare get yourself hurt. Don't you dare give up on me." Emily snapped back, more sharply than she intended. Fear bled into anger. "You're coming out of this, do you hear me?" Max barked once, loud and firm, the sound ricocheting against the sagging porch. Emily froze. She knew that bark, not one of alarm, but a command. He was telling her to wait. She glanced at him, and he stared back, amber eyes steady. Then he moved, not toward Mrs. Thompson, but to the side of the porch where a jagged panel of siding flapped in the wind. He sniffed once, then began pawing at the debris. Emily's breath caught. "A sideway in," she murmured. She scrambled after him, shoving boards aside as he dug. Together, they uncovered a narrow gap between the collapsed lattice and the ground. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for Max to crawl through. Emily hesitated, chewing her lip. If the roof shifted while he was inside. But Max looked back at her, ears up, tail stiff with resolve. He was waiting for permission. Her chest tightened. "Okay," she whispered. "Go. Find her." Max dropped low, belly scraping the mud, and wriggled through the gap. Emily pressed her face to the opening, heart hammering as she watched his tail vanish into the shadows. Inside, wood creaked and dust fell, but his steady snuffling sounds reassured her. "Emily?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was faint, weak. "I sent Max," Emily called. "He's coming to you." There was silence, then a small, incredulous laugh. "That dog of yours, he's something else." Emily's throat tightened. "Yeah," she said softly, "he is." She could hear Max now, closer to Mrs. Thompson. His low whine filtered out, followed by a muffled rustle. Then a sharp bark, 2 in a row. Emily sucked in a breath. That was his found-it signal. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The porch groaned again, a nail shrieking loose, a board snapping. Emily scrambled back, terrified it would all come down. "Max! Come back," she cried, panic clawing at her throat. But instead of retreating, Max barked again, shorter this time, urgent. Emily peered through the gap. In the dimness, she saw him braced against a board that pinned Mrs. Thompson's legs, his strong body pushing, straining. "No, Max, it's too heavy," she shouted. He growled low, muscles quivering as he shoved harder. Mrs. Thompson whimpered. Emily's nails dug into the mud. She couldn't let him do this alone. Adrenaline surged. Emily shoved her shoulder into the collapsed siding, heaving until it tore wider. Splinters scraped her arms, but she forced herself through. Inside, the porch smelled of mildew, soaked wood, and fear. Rain still leaked through cracks above, dripping onto the wreckage. Hold on, she gasped, crawling to Max's side. We'll do this together. She braced her hands under the beam and pushed with everything she had. Her muscles screamed. The wood resisted, heavy and slick, but Max pressed with her, his body a wall of strength against hers. Inch by inch, the beam shifted. Mrs. Thompson whimpered again, then cried out as the weight lifted from her legs. Emily shoved harder, her teeth gritted, until Max barked sharply and the beam rolled enough for Mrs. Thompson to drag her trembling legs free. Emily let go, the beam slamming down inches from her toes. She gasped, sweat and rain mixing on her face. You're safe, she panted, grabbing Mrs. Thompson's arm. We've got you. Max wagged his tail once, panting, his amber eyes locked on Emily's as though to say mission complete. But they weren't out of danger yet. The porch groaned again, a deeper, more ominous sound. Dust rained down, boards shifting. We have to move. Emily cried. She hooked her arms under Mrs. Thompson's shoulders, dragging her toward the opening. Max slipped out first, then turned, bracing himself against the mud to help pull. Emily pushed, Mrs. Thompson struggled, and together, with Max tugging gently at the woman's sleeve, they got her out just as the porch gave a final shudder. The collapse came in a rush of noise and splinters. The roof caved fully, timbers snapping like bones. Emily threw herself over Mrs. Thompson, shielding her as debris thundered down just feet away. Max planted himself beside them, barking furiously at the wreckage as though daring it to try again. When the dust settled, the porch was nothing but a heap of shattered wood. But Mrs. Thompson was alive. Emily clutched her, tears streaking her rain-soaked face. You're safe now, she whispered, voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson coughed, then reached a frail hand to stroke Max's wet fur. And all thanks to him. Emily met Max's steady gaze, her chest tightening. In the chaos of the storm, when everything seemed lost, it was his loyalty, his courage, that had pulled them through. But even as relief washed over her, a new sound rose in the distance, faint at first, then growing, sirens. And behind them, another rumble of thunder rolling across the sky. Emily's breath caught. It's not over, she murmured. Max's ears pricked forward, body tense again. The storm was circling back. The momentary calm was shattered by the distant growl of thunder rolling back across the horizon. Emily froze, her chest tightening as she realized the storm wasn't finished with them. Storm systems in their part of the country sometimes came in waves, and this one was circling for another strike. The wreckage around them was proof of what just one pass could do. Mrs. Thompson clutched Emily's sleeve, her frail hands trembling. We can't take another one like that, she whispered. Emily nodded quickly, though her heart pounded so hard she could barely think. The sirens in the distance wailed louder now, a haunting soundtrack to their desperate situation. Somewhere nearby, emergency crews were racing into the chaos, but with roads blocked and houses shredded, there was no guarantee anyone would reach them in time. Max growled low, his ears pinned back, nose testing the wind. He shifted his weight forward, body rigid, pointing himself toward the road. Emily understood, he wanted them moving, away from the broken houses, toward open space. The danger wasn't over, and Max knew it. Okay, she breathed, her hand gripping his wet ruff. We'll head toward the street. Away from the gas leak. Supporting Mrs. Thompson's weight on one side, Emily urged her forward. Max took the other flank, every step deliberate, his body brushing against the elderly woman as if guiding her, steadying her faltering steps. It wasn't easy, the ground was a minefield of broken branches, shards of glass, and jagged wood. Rain still fell in sheets, blinding, and the dark sky pressed down on them with oppressive weight. They moved slowly, inch by inch. Each gust of wind sent fresh debris tumbling. A mailbox skittered across the road like a toy. A street sign groaned, bent nearly double, its metal screaming as it twisted under the storm's relentless grip. Emily's foot caught on a broken fence post, sending her stumbling forward. She nearly toppled, but Max barked sharply and pressed into her side, catching her balance before she could bring Mrs. Thompson down with her. "Thanks, boy," she gasped, her throat raw. The sound of the sirens grew sharper, closer. And then, at the far end of the street, flashing red and blue lights cut through the rain. A fire truck, its massive bulk pushing carefully over debris, crept closer. Behind it, an ambulance's headlights blazed, wipers struggling against the torrent. Relief surged through Emily like lightning. "They're here," she shouted over the roar of the wind. Mrs. Thompson sagged in her arms, half sobbing. "Thank the Lord." But Max's growl deepened. He didn't take his eyes off the sky. Emily followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Above them, the clouds twisted unnaturally, a spiral forming, dark, funneling, dipping low. It wasn't just another storm front. It was a tornado, trying to form right over their street. Panic surged. Emily glanced at the fire truck. The first responders were climbing down, shouting orders she couldn't hear over the wind. One pointed at the funnel cloud and waved frantically toward them, motioning to move faster. Emily tightened her grip on Mrs. Thompson. "We have to run." But the woman stumbled, her legs too weak to carry her. Emily tried to lift her, but her own strength was failing. That's when Max barked, sharp, commanding, and moved in front of them. He stood squarely between Emily and the forming tornado, his chest lifted, his stance defiant, as if ready to fight the storm itself. Emily's throat tightened. She knew what he was telling her without words. "Don't give up. Keep moving. I'll protect you." She dragged Mrs. Thompson forward, step by agonizing step. Max moved with them, his body shielding theirs, pushing them onward even as the winds whipped harder. When they finally reached the fire truck, strong arms grabbed Mrs. Thompson and hauled her up. Emily stumbled after, her muscles burning with exhaustion. Max leapt onto the step of the truck with ease, shaking water from his coat before standing tall, his amber eyes still locked on the swirling clouds overhead. The tornado had dipped lower now, its funnel reaching hungrily toward the ground. But with sirens blaring, neighbors screaming, and first responders ushering survivors into the vehicles, one thing was certain: this wasn't just about escaping the storm. It was about surviving together. Emily clutched Max's fur, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Don't leave me, boy. We're not done yet." Max leaned against her, steady and unyielding, his loyalty burning like a beacon in the chaos. The roof of her house had been torn away, their world reduced to wreckage, but the fight wasn't over. And neither was their bond. The fire truck sirens blared like war drums as first responders surged into the wreckage-strewn street. Shouts rang through the gale, voices muffled by the wind, yet urgent enough to cut through. Emily stumbled forward, half blind from rain, her arm hooked around Mrs. Thompson's frail frame. Strong hands reached for them, pulling the older woman onto a stretcher. Emily followed, her breath ragged, her legs trembling. Max leapt up beside them without hesitation. His body shook water in a violent spray, then he planted himself at Emily's knee, a solid wall of presence. He wasn't going anywhere. Not while she was here. "Get them inside," a firefighter yelled, pointing toward the ambulance. Emily nodded, but when she turned her head, her breath snagged. Above the chaos, the funnel cloud had descended lower, twisting like a black serpent hungry for ground. The sound of it deepened, not the wild scream of wind, but a monstrous growl, steady and terrible, filling the air like the earth itself was tearing apart. "Move, move, move," another rescuer shouted. The team rushed Mrs. Thompson toward the ambulance, stretcher wheels bumping violently over debris. Emily tried to follow, but the wind shoved her sideways, slamming her shoulder against the side of the fire truck. Pain lanced through her arm, but Max barked furiously, pressing his body into hers until she steadied. The tornado's tail brushed the ground at the far end of the street now, kicking up a storm of dirt and debris. Trees bowed and snapped, rooftops peeled away like paper. Emily's heart hammered. They wouldn't make it inside the ambulance in time. Not before that monster swallowed the block. One of the firefighters swore loudly. Basement shelter. Now. He pointed toward a concrete storm shelter built halfway into the ground behind the fire station across the street. It was little more than a slab with a heavy steel door, but in this moment it was salvation. This way, he barked, and the group veered sharply, abandoning the ambulance for the shelter. Emily dragged herself forward, Max pulling ahead like a guide rope in fur. Rain blinded her, wind clawed at her, but she fixed her gaze on the shelter door. Behind them, the tornado roared louder, a predator closing the distance. Suddenly, a scream cut through the storm. Emily twisted her head. One of the firefighters had stumbled, pinned under a fallen telephone pole. The man shouted, struggling, but the others were too far ahead, focused on dragging Mrs. Thompson. Emily's body moved before her mind caught up. She ran, Max at her side, skidding through the mud toward the trapped man. The pole was heavy, wires sparking dangerously around it. "Help me," he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. Emily crouched, shoving against the beam. It didn't budge. Her muscles screamed. Rain washed mud down her face. The tornado's growl grew into a roar. She was wasting time. Then Max wedged himself under the pole, straining with a growl so fierce it cut through the storm. His paws dug furrows in the mud, his shoulders trembling with effort. Emily pushed again, screaming with exertion. Inch by inch, the pole shifted. The firefighter scrambled free, gasping. "Go!" Emily shouted, and together they sprinted toward the shelter. The others had already reached it, the steel door groaning as rescuers yanked it open. Inside, dark concrete stairs beckoned. Emily shoved the firefighter ahead, then grabbed Max's collar, dragging him with her as the wind behind them rose to a shriek. The moment they crossed the threshold, the tornado hit. The ground shook like an earthquake, the air filling with the sound of ripping, tearing, obliterating. Rescuers slammed the steel door shut, plunging them into darkness lit only by a few dim lanterns. Emily collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. Max leaned against her, his fur dripping, his body radiating heat and strength. She buried her face in his neck, trembling. "We made it," she whispered. "We're alive." But as the roar above shook the shelter walls, she knew the storm wasn't done. It was just beginning. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a clang that echoed through the cramped storm shelter. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged breathing, dozens of lungs gulping air in a space too small for so many people. Then the storm's rage thundered above, shaking the concrete walls like a living beast clawing at their sanctuary. The floor trembled. Dust sifted from the ceiling, coating wet skin in a fine, gritty film. Emily clutched Max's collar, her other hand gripping the rough wall as if it were the only anchor she had left. Around her, neighbors huddled close, eyes wide with terror. A child whimpered, muffled against his mother's chest. Someone whispered a prayer, their words blending into the storm's howl. Max stood tall despite the crush of bodies, his amber eyes glowing in the dim lantern light. His ears swiveled, tracking every sound, every vibration. When the walls shook hardest, he pressed against Emily's legs, grounding her. But then he would lift his nose, sniffing the stale, damp air with quick, sharp breaths. Emily noticed it too. A smell. Faint, metallic, and sharp. She frowned. "Gas," she whispered, the word barely audible. One of the firefighters overheard. He turned his head sharply. "Where?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know." He smelled it first. She nodded toward Max, who had begun pacing, weaving between people, nose pressed to the cracks in the concrete. His hackles were raised. He let out a low growl that sent shivers down Emily's spine. The firefighter cursed under his breath. A line must have ruptured nearby. If it seeps in, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Panic rippled through the group. A woman grabbed her child tighter, eyes darting toward the sealed door. Another man pressed his hand to the wall as if he could feel danger creeping through the cracks. Max barked once, sharp, commanding. Everyone fell silent. He trotted toward the far corner of the shelter, then stopped, staring at a thin crack running along the wall near the floor. Emily followed, crouching beside him. The smell was stronger here. Her stomach knotted. "What do we do?" she asked the firefighter. He ran a hand through his soaked hair. "We can't open that door until the tornado passes. If we do, we're done." Another boom shook the shelter, dust raining from the ceiling. Someone screamed. The child began crying harder. Emily pulled Max close, burying her face in his wet fur. His heartbeat thudded against her cheek, steady, calm, unyielding. And then, silence. Not calm silence, but the eerie, suffocating quiet that sometimes followed the eye of a storm. The kind of quiet that made the air itself feel heavy. Everyone held their breath. Max didn't move. He stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the steel door, his body vibrating with tension. Emily whispered, "What is it, boy?" The answer came in the form of a screech that made her ears ring. The hinges of the shelter door shrieked as something massive slammed into it from above. Dust poured down. The entire shelter rocked like a ship struck by a wave. People screamed, grabbing at one another, trying to stay upright. "It's tearing at the door," someone shouted. "No," the firefighter barked. "That's the debris. The tornado's dragging half the town with it." The roar returned, louder than ever, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Boards, metal, and God knows what else slammed into the shelter's roof. The lantern light flickered. Emily wrapped her arms around Max, pressing her forehead against his wet coat. Then came another sound, faint, muffled, but distinct. A cry. Not from inside the shelter. From outside. Emily's blood ran cold. Max lifted his head sharply, ears pricked, and let out a single, mournful howl that silenced the entire room. His eyes locked on Emily's, burning with urgency. He had heard it too. "No," she whispered. "There can't be." But the cry came again, thin and terrified, carried through the storm's shriek, a child's voice, crying for help. Emily's stomach turned to ice. There was someone still out there. Max barked furiously, pawing at the door, his nails scraping metal. He wasn't going to let it go. Not this cry. Not this soul. Emily's heart hammered as she turned to the firefighter. "There's a kid out there." The man's face drained of color. He shook his head. "We can't open that door. You don't understand, if that funnel's still over us, we'll all die." The child screamed again. Max howled, long and low, his body trembling with the force of his desperation. Emily's fists clenched. Her voice shook, but it carried in the silence that followed. "If that were your child, would you sit here?" No one answered. Max barked again, the sound like thunder in the confined space. His tail was stiff, his chest lifted, his entire body vibrating with a singular truth: he would go, with or without them. Emily pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "We'll find them. Together." The firefighter cursed, grabbed his radio, and shouted into it for backup, for a chance, for anything. But Emily already knew. The storm had taken everything from her once before. She wasn't about to let it take a child. The shelter shook again, louder, closer. The storm was merciless. But Max was more unyielding still. The cries outside came again, carried by the storm like a dagger through the dark. This time, no one in the shelter could deny it, a child's voice, thin and terrified, crying for help. The sound broke through the roar above, piercing the gloom like lightning. Emily's heart twisted. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run toward that voice. She looked around the cramped shelter, Pale faces stared back at her, wide eyes filled with fear. The firefighter who had warned her against opening the door shook his head, jaw tight, his hands gripping his radio like it was the only lifeline he had left. "We can't," he muttered, almost to himself. "If that funnel's still out there." Max barked, furious and sharp, silencing him. The shepherd pressed against the steel door, pawing so hard that sparks of metal scraped under his nails. His growl rumbled like thunder, his amber eyes locked on Emily. There was no hesitation in them, no doubt. He had heard the call for help, and he would not let it go unanswered. Emily felt her throat tighten. "You want to go," she whispered, the truth tearing through her like the wind tearing through rooftops. "You want me to follow?" Max barked once, short and resolute. The firefighter snapped, "It's suicide." He pointed toward the ceiling as the shelter rattled again. "You open that door, and we'll all be ripped apart." Another cry came from outside, this one choked with panic. "Please! Somebody help me!" The sound snapped something inside Emily. She turned on the firefighter, her voice raw, shaking. "If that was your kid, would you sit here and argue while they screamed for you?" Silence followed. No one spoke. But Max's growl filled the void, rising louder, demanding action. Emily stood, her knees trembling, but her voice steady. "I'm not staying down here while a child dies above us. I don't care if the storm takes me. I'm going." Several people gasped. Mrs. Thompson, pale and trembling on her stretcher, raised her head. "Emily," she rasped, "if you go, take him with you. That dog, he'll never leave your side." Emily's chest ached with equal parts fear and gratitude. She rested her hand on Max's soaked ruff. He already made that choice. The firefighter cursed and slammed his radio against the wall. "Fine," he barked. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. We open that door for 10 seconds, no more. You go, you grab whoever's screaming, and you get back here before the tornado eats us alive. Understood?" Emily nodded sharply. Understood. Max barked again, pacing in tight circles, his body vibrating with anticipation. He pressed against Emily's legs, ready to explode through the door the second it cracked open. The firefighter moved to the handle, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. He looked back once. "When I open this, there's no going back. Are you sure?" Emily swallowed, the child's cry echoing in her ears. She met Max's eyes, unwavering, unyielding. "I'm sure." The firefighter took a deep breath, braced himself, and threw the lock. The steel door shrieked as it cracked open against the howling wind. Chaos erupted instantly. The storm screamed into the shelter like a monster unleashed, tearing at clothing, pelting them with rain. Dust and grit blasted Emily's face, blinding her. Max lunged forward, barking furiously, pulling her into the gale. Emily squinted through the storm, eyes stinging. There, through the haze of flying debris, a small figure crouched against the wreckage of a tree, arms wrapped around a teddy bear. A little girl, no older than 7, her face streaked with mud and tears. Emily's heart seized. "We've got her," she screamed, though her voice was swallowed by the roar. She lunged forward, Max leaping ahead, his body a shield against the wind. The tornado loomed like a wall of black, its tail churning the ground only yards away, shredding everything in its path. But Emily didn't stop. She threw herself toward the girl, scooping her up in her arms. The child clung to her desperately, sobbing into her neck. "Don't let go. Please don't let go." "I won't," Emily gasped, pressing her face to the girl's muddy hair. "You're safe. I promise." Max barked once, then pivoted sharply, leading the way back toward the shelter. Debris rained down around them, shingles, branches, shards of glass, but he dodged and weaved, his instincts guiding them through the chaos. The firefighter at the shelter door shouted, his voice hoarse. "Hurry! Now. Emily staggered forward, every step a battle against the storm's grip. The wind clawed at her, trying to rip the girl from her arms. She screamed in defiance, clutching the child tighter. Max barked at the storm itself, his body pressed against Emily's legs, keeping her steady. Finally, hands reached out, grabbing her, dragging her back inside. The steel door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. Inside, the shelter erupted in gasps and sobs. The little girl clung to Emily, trembling, her teddy bear crushed between them. Emily sank to her knees, cradling her, tears streaming down her face. Max stood tall beside them, chest heaving, fur dripping, but his eyes steady, proud. Emily buried her face against his wet coat and whispered, "We did it. You did it." And though the storm still roared above, inside that cramped shelter, there was a moment of pure, unbreakable triumph. The steel door slammed shut behind them with such force the hinges groaned, the sound swallowed instantly by the monster outside. The shelter plunged back into dim light and raw silence, except for the storm's fury hammering at the world above. It was louder now, deeper, as if the tornado itself had taken offense at their defiance. The walls shuddered under the assault. Emily collapsed onto the damp floor, the rescued girl still clinging to her neck like a lifeline. The child's sobs echoed through the tight space, raw and uneven. Emily rubbed her back, murmuring nonsense meant only to soothe. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're safe now. We've got you." Neighbors pressed closer, reaching out tentative hands. A woman pulled her own shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it around the shivering child. Another man handed over a half-empty water bottle. The atmosphere shifted, fear still gripped them all, but now it was laced with awe. They had just watched Emily and Max step into the storm's teeth and return with a child alive. Mrs. Thompson, pale on her stretcher, lifted a trembling hand. "Bring her here," she whispered. "She can sit with me." Emily eased the little girl over, but the child's small fists refused to let go of Max's fur. The shepherd stood perfectly still, tolerating the death grip without a flinch. His only movement was a slow lean, pressing more of his body into the girl's arms as if to reassure her. At last, the child loosened her hold on Emily enough to sit beside Mrs. Thompson, though her tiny hand stayed buried in Max's coat. Emily's chest ached at the sight. "He won't leave you," she promised softly. "He never leaves." Then the storm hit harder. The ground jolted under them as if an invisible giant had stomped its foot. Dust poured from the ceiling. Somewhere above, timbers snapped in rapid succession, each crack louder than the last. The air pressure shifted so violently that ears popped, children cried out, and grown men clamped their hands over their heads. One of the lanterns toppled, clattering across the floor, its light wobbling wildly across pale faces. A firefighter caught it, righted it, then swore under his breath, "That funnel's right above us." Another boom shook the shelter, and the steel door buckled inward by a fraction, shrieking against its frame. Panic surged. People pressed back against the walls, eyes wide with terror. Someone screamed, "It's going to tear us open." Max barked, loud, defiant, the sound ricocheting off concrete and cutting through the hysteria. Everyone froze. He barked again, then lowered himself into a rigid stance between the door and the cluster of people, hackles high, eyes blazing. Emily felt the fear in her throat loosen just a little. Max wasn't just guarding her. He was guarding all of them. She pushed to her feet, bracing herself beside him. "We hold on," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We hold on until it passes. Look at him, he's not afraid. If he can stand, so can we." Dozens of eyes turned toward the dog, and in that instant, his calm became contagious. The room hushed. Breaths slowed. Parents soothed their children by pointing toward the shepherd standing unbroken in front of the storm. The tornado raged above for what felt like an eternity. The shelter groaned, concrete vibrating like a struck drum. Rainwater seeped through hairline cracks and trickled down the walls. Every few seconds, something massive slammed against the roof, entire trees, cars, roofs torn from homes. But the steel door held. The walls held. And so did the people inside, their eyes anchored on Max's silhouette in the lantern light. At last, after minutes stretched long enough to feel like hours, the roar began to thin. The deep growl of the funnel receded, fading into a hollow moan, then into nothing more than the steady drum of rain. Silence fell again, this time heavy and exhausted. Emily sank to her knees beside Max, wrapping her arms around his neck. Her tears mixed with the dampness of his fur. "We're still here," she whispered. "We're still alive." The little girl, still clinging to Max, spoke for the first time since they pulled her in. Her voice was small but steady. "He saved me." The words rippled through the shelter, breaking what fear had left. People nodded, murmured in agreement. Some even smiled weakly through tears. It wasn't just Emily who felt it, Max had become more than a dog to them. He was their anchor, their courage in flesh and fur. Emily pressed her forehead to his. "You're our hero, Max." The storm had not broken him. And as long as he stood, neither would they. When the storm finally moved on, it left behind a silence so absolute it was almost unbearable. The shelter door no longer rattled. The ground stopped trembling. The roar had dwindled into the distant groan of thunder. For a long moment, no one moved. The survivors sat frozen in the dim glow of lanterns, afraid to believe it was truly over. Emily pressed her ear against the cold concrete wall. All she could hear was the steady patter of rain. No freight train howl. No violent tearing. Just rain. She looked down at Max. His ears were still pricked, but his body had loosened, the rigid tension easing into alert readiness. He gave a soft chuff and flicked his gaze at the steel door. "He says it's safe," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse but certain. The firefighter moved slowly, as though every muscle in his body resisted the thought of opening that door. He laid a hand on the latch, closed his eyes, and drew in a long breath. "All right," he muttered. "Here goes." The lock clanked. The door groaned, resisting at first as if even it had been traumatized. Then, with a sharp shove, it creaked open, spilling pale gray daylight into the shelter. The air that rushed and smelled of wet earth, split timber, and something metallic and raw, like the scent of a wound. Emily blinked as her eyes adjusted. When she finally stepped forward, Max at her side, the world outside took her breath away. What had once been their street was now a wasteland. Houses stood like skeletons, walls stripped, roofs gone. Trees were sheared off at the trunk, their limbs scattered like bones across mud-slick lawns. Power lines draped across the ground like black veins, sparking faintly in the drizzle. Cars lay overturned, windows shattered. Gasps and sobs rose from the people behind her as they followed out into the gray morning. Children clutched at their parents, some too shocked to cry. The little girl with the teddy bear held tighter to Max's fur, her wide eyes reflecting the wreckage. Emily's stomach twisted as she scanned the devastation. Her own home, or what remained of it, lay in ruin. The roof gone. The porch collapsed. Water dripping from jagged beams into the shell that had once been her sanctuary. The sight stole her breath. Max pressed against her leg, steadying her before grief could topple her. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the wreckage for danger, his stance unbroken. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, clutched his damp fur, and whispered, "I know. We can't stop now." The firefighter gathered the group, his voice rough but determined. "We need to move toward the fire station. The shelter there is intact, and crews are already setting up aid. Stay together. Watch your step." Emily nodded, wrapping her arm around the little girl's shoulders. "Stick with me," she said gently. They began to walk, a slow procession through the ruin. The drizzle soaked their clothes, plastering hair to faces streaked with dirt and tears. Each step crunched over glass, snapped twigs, and broken plaster. But Max led the way, head high, weaving through the wreckage with confidence. At one point, the group halted at a toppled oak tree blocking their path. The trunk sprawled across the road, limbs tangled with wires. Max sniffed, then turned sharply down a narrow alley between two half-demolished houses. Emily followed without hesitation, trusting him. The others, hesitant at first, fell in line behind. Sure enough, the alley wound them around the blockage and back to the main road, safe and clear. A murmur of amazement rippled through the survivors. Emily caught one man whispering, "That dog's leading us." Max glanced back at the group briefly, as if to make sure they were still following, then pushed forward again. His paws splashed through puddles, his tail a dark banner of determination. As they neared the fire station, the devastation became even clearer. Emergency crews were everywhere, firemen hauling chainsaws, paramedics triaging injured survivors under makeshift tarps, volunteers unloading water bottles and blankets from the back of trucks. The sound of crying, shouting, and sirens blended into a raw chorus of survival. Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief. They had made it. Against all odds, they had walked out of the storm's path alive. The little girl tugged at Emily's sleeve. Her eyes were still wide, but steadier now. "I knew he'd find me," she whispered, looking at Max. "Dogs always know." Emily swallowed hard, her chest tight with emotion. She hugged the girl close, then looked down at Max, who sat calmly despite the chaos around them, rain dripping from his ears. "Yeah," Emily murmured, stroking his head. "Dogs always know." For the first time since the storm began, Emily allowed herself to believe they would be okay. The days after the storm blurred into one another, long hours of sorting rubble, waiting in relief lines, and watching neighbors stagger through grief and disbelief. The storm had torn not only roofs and walls but also the illusion of safety they had all carried. Yet amid the devastation, something unexpected began to take root. Emily worked alongside strangers and friends alike, hauling lumber, clearing roads, delivering bottled water. Everywhere she went, Max padded by her side, his black and tan coat a banner of steadiness in a world shaken to pieces. People began to notice him more than her. Volunteers who had never spoken to her before knelt to scratch behind his ears. Exhausted mothers let their children cling to his fur for comfort. Firefighters, bruised and caked with mud, smiled when he pressed his nose into their hands as if to remind them they weren't alone. The little girl they had saved, her name was Lily, never left Max's side. Even as aid workers set up a temporary shelter for her and reunited her with surviving relatives, she always searched the crowd for the shepherd. When she found him, her face lit up, and she'd whisper into his fur as though he were the only one who could carry her secrets. Emily watched this transformation with quiet awe. Before the storm, Max had been her anchor, her shadow, her protector. After it, he became the neighborhood's. People whispered about him as if he were more than a dog, as though he were a guardian sent to guide them through the storm. On the third day, when the Red Cross arrived with supplies, a volunteer brought a wooden board to mark the aid station. Someone painted words across it in thick black strokes: "Storm Survivor Shelter, protected by Max." The name stuck. Emily stood in front of that sign with tears stinging her eyes. She stroked Max's head, her voice cracking. "You're not just mine anymore," she whispered. "You're theirs too." That evening, as the sun bled red over the broken horizon, Emily sat on the curb, her clothes still caked with mud, her hands raw from labor. Max lay across her feet, his head on his paws, eyes scanning the crowd as always. Children laughed, a sound she hadn't heard since before the storm, as they chased one another between piles of debris. Neighbors shared food, traded stories, and for the first time, there was more than grief in their voices. There was gratitude. Mrs. Thompson, now bandaged but recovering, shuffled over with her cane. she sank onto the curb beside Emily with a heavy sigh. He saved me. He saved that little girl. And he saved all of us in that shelter. You know that, don't you? Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I know. The older woman smiled faintly, reaching down to pat Max's fur. Then don't ever let anyone forget it. In the weeks that followed, rebuilding began. The fire station became a hub of hope, a place where supplies were shared and plans were made. And every evening, as the work ended, survivors gathered near the sign with Max at its base. He became their symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when the storm tried to tear everything apart, some bonds could not be broken. Emily carved her own addition into the wooden board one night, the letters uneven but heartfelt, loyalty weathered the storm. When she stepped back, Max stood beside her, his tail wagging faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the storm clouds had once swirled. He had faced the chaos, the roar, the ruin, and never once left her side. Emily crouched down, hugging him tight. You'll always be my hero, she whispered. And though the wind rustled softly through the broken trees, there was no roar left in it. The storm had passed. What remained was the unshakable truth carved into every heart that survived. When the roof tore away, when the world collapsed, when fear screamed louder than hope, Max never moved. He stayed. And that loyalty was stronger than any storm.